They called him the Desert Fox, and even his enemies whispered the name with respect. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was a ghost in the sand, a phantom who struck where you least expected and vanished before you could retaliate. In the scorching wastelands of North Africa, he had become a legend, a commander who moved like lightning across the dunes, outthinking and outmaneuvering forces that outnumbered him 3-1. British soldiers told stories about him around their campfires. American generals studied his tactics in their tents. He was the man who made the impossible look easy, who turned retreat into victory and defeat into escape. Rommel had not been born into greatness. He was no aristocrat with a military bloodline stretching back centuries. He was the son of a schoolteacher, a man who rose through sheer brilliance and an almost supernatural understanding of war. In France, during the invasion of 1940, he had commanded the 7th Panzer Division with such speed and aggression that they called it the Ghost Division. It moved so fast that even German high command lost track of it. Then came Africa, and with it, immortality. In the desert, Rommel became something more than human. He understood that war was not just about firepower, but about deception, speed, and nerve. He would feint left and strike right. He would retreat to draw you in, then spring the trap when you grew careless. His tanks rolled across the sand like hunting wolves, and his men followed him with a devotion that bordered on worship. They believed in him because he believed in them, because he shared their hardships, ate their rations, slept in the same dust and heat. The British feared him. Winston Churchill himself spoke of Rommel in Parliament, calling him a great general, even as their armies fought desperately to stop him. There was something almost romantic about the Desert War, something clean compared to the horrors unfolding elsewhere. Out there, in the endless sand, it felt like war the way it was supposed to be. Soldier against soldier, skill against skill, with a strange kind of honor that existed nowhere else in this terrible conflict. But Rommel was more than a tactician. He possessed something rare among Hitler's generals, a conscience. He treated prisoners with dignity. He refused orders to execute captured commandos. When he found that SS units were committing atrocities in North Africa, he threatened to resign unless they were removed from his command. In a regime built on cruelty, Rommel remained, impossibly, decent. Perhaps that was why people loved him, why even his enemies could not bring themselves to truly hate him. He was the face Germany wanted to show the world, the honorable warrior, untainted by the darkness that consumed his homeland.
But legends cannot last forever, and even the Desert Fox could not hold back the tide. By 1943, the war in Africa was lost. Overwhelming Allied numbers, endless supplies, and the vast American industrial machine ground down Rommel's forces. He retreated, fighting brilliantly even in defeat, but retreat it was nonetheless. And with defeat came something Rommel had not experienced before: doubt. Hitler summoned him back to Germany, and in those meetings, Rommel saw clearly what he had tried not to see from the distant deserts of Africa. His Führer was mad. The man was not the strong leader Rommel had once believed in, but a raving fanatic who lived in a fantasy world of his own creation. Hitler screamed about wonder weapons that would turn the tide, about victories that existed only in his imagination. He demanded that armies stand and die rather than retreat to fight another day. He sent boys and old men to face battle-hardened enemies and called it strategy. Rommel began to speak out. Carefully at first, then with growing urgency, he told Hitler the truth, that Germany was losing, that the war could not be won, that they must seek peace before the homeland was destroyed utterly. These words were poison to Hitler's ears. The Führer did not want truth, he wanted obedience. He wanted generals who would tell him what he wished to hear, not what he needed to know. By 1944, Rommel commanded the Atlantic Wall, Hitler's grandiose defense system, meant to hurl any Allied invasion back into the sea. Rommel toured the French coast and saw not a wall, but a fiction. The defenses were incomplete, undermanned, undersupplied. When the Allies came, and Rommel knew they would come, this wall would not hold. He worked frantically to strengthen the fortifications, knowing in his heart it would not be enough. And then came June, D-Day. The Allied invasion Rommel had warned about, that he had tried desperately to prepare for, smashed into the French coast like the fist of an angry god. Despite everything Rommel had done, despite the brilliant positions and the desperate fighting, the Atlantic Wall crumbled. The Allies poured through, and there was nothing Rommel could do to stop them. In the chaos of those terrible weeks, Rommel's doubt hardened into certainty. Germany had lost. Not would lose, but had lost. The only question now was how many more had to die before Hitler admitted it. Rommel thought of his wife Lucy, his son Manfred, of the Germany he loved being pounded into rubble by Allied bombs. He thought of the senseless deaths, the wasted lives, the boys being fed into a meat grinder for a war that was already over. Something broke inside him, or perhaps something finally healed. The soldier who had served without question now questioned everything. The loyal officer began to listen when others spoke of removing Hitler from power, not out of ambition, but out of love. Love for Germany, for the men dying needlessly, for the future that would be destroyed if this madness continued.
There were others who saw what Rommel saw, officers who remembered their oaths to Germany, not to a madman, men who loved their country enough to risk everything to save it. They planned in whispers and shadows, knowing that discovery meant death. They called it Operation Valkyrie, and at its heart was a simple idea: kill Hitler, make peace with the Western Allies, save Germany from total destruction. Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg was the man who would carry the bomb, a war hero who had lost an eye, an arm, and 2 fingers in combat. He was everything Hitler claimed to admire, but would never truly understand. On July 20, 1944, Stauffenberg walked into Hitler's conference room at the Wolf's Lair, carrying a briefcase with death inside. He placed it near Hitler, made an excuse to leave, and walked away as calmly as a man could while carrying the weight of history on his shoulders. The bomb exploded, the room disintegrated in fire and smoke. For a few precious hours, the conspirators believed they had succeeded. Orders went out. The coup began. But then came the news that every one of them had prayed would never come. Hitler had survived. Someone had moved the briefcase. The heavy oak table had shielded him. The Führer lived, and his rage would be biblical. The Gestapo descended like wolves. They arrested hundreds. Torture chambers filled with screams. Hitler wanted names, and pain always produces names eventually. Some of the conspirators had mentioned Rommel. Some said he knew. Others said he sympathized. A few claimed he was meant to lead Germany after Hitler's death. The truth was more complicated. Rommel had known that some officers wanted Hitler removed. He had listened to their arguments and in his heart agreed with them. But assassination? Rommel was a soldier, not an assassin. He believed Hitler should be arrested, tried, removed from power through proper channels. Naive thinking, perhaps, in a regime where proper channels had long since rotted away. He had not planted the bomb. He had not been part of the inner circle. But he had known, and he had not reported it. And in Nazi Germany, that was enough. 3 days before the assassination attempt, Rommel's staff car had been strafed by British fighters. His driver died. The car crashed. Rommel's skull was fractured in 3 places. As the plotters moved forward with their desperate plan, he lay unconscious in a hospital, unaware that history was being written in his name. It would not save him. Perhaps nothing could have.
Rommel recovered slowly at his home in Herlingen, a small village in southern Germany. His head throbbed with constant pain. His left eye had been damaged. He moved carefully, his once strong body suddenly fragile. But the wounds to his body were nothing compared to what was coming. The investigation into the July 20 plot spread like a plague. The Gestapo worked with methodical brutality, following every thread, extracting every name. They arrested generals, colonels, politicians, anyone who had ever expressed doubt. Some they hanged with piano wire from meat hooks, making sure they died slowly while cameras recorded everything for Hitler to watch. Others they shot, or tortured until death came as a mercy. The regime was eating itself, devouring anyone who might threaten its grip on power. Rommel's name came up again and again in the interrogations, always carefully, always with the kind of vagueness that could mean everything or nothing. The investigators noted it, filed it, let it grow into a pattern. They could not ignore the pattern, even if they wanted to, and some of them did not want to. Martin Bormann, Hitler's secretary and a man who had the Führer's ear, saw an opportunity. Rommel was beloved by the German people, popular in a way that made him dangerous. If such a man could turn against Hitler, what did that say about the regime? Better to remove him, to eliminate a potential rival, to send a message that no one was beyond reach. Bormann whispered in Hitler's ear, adding poison to an already poisoned well. The pressure built slowly, inexorably, like water rising in a locked room. Officers who had served with Rommel were interrogated about him. Friends were asked pointed questions. The net was tightening, and Rommel could feel it even through the fog of his injuries. Strange cars appeared near his home. Men in leather coats watched from the village square. His phone calls seemed to echo strangely, as if other ears were listening. His wife, Lucy, saw it too. She watched her husband grow quiet and distant, staring out windows to something only he could see. She knew the signs. After a lifetime married to a soldier, she understood when danger was approaching. But what could they do? Run? Where? They were in the heart of Germany, surrounded by the regime. Fight? Against what? An investigation? A whisper campaign? The slowly closing fist of the state? Rommel tried to continue as if everything were normal. He wrote reports about the military situation, though no one asked for them. He advised on defensive strategies, though his advice was ignored. He was Germany's most famous general, and he had become irrelevant. Worse than irrelevant, he had become a problem that needed to be solved. In those quiet weeks at Hurlingen, as autumn began to paint the trees gold and red, Rommel must have felt it, the end approaching. Not in battle, not with honor and glory, but in some quiet, terrible way that had nothing to do with war, and everything to do with the monster Germany had become. He had survived thousands of battles, had faced death 100 times on burning desert sand, only to die at home, in his own country, at the hands of men he had once called comrades.
October 14, 1944, a Saturday. The kind of autumn morning that should have been peaceful, with mist rising from the fields and the sun warm despite the season. Rommel was home, still recovering, still trying to pretend that everything would somehow be all right. Lucy was in the house. Their son Manfred, 15 years old, was there too, on leave from his anti-aircraft unit. A family together, perhaps for the last time, though they did not know it yet. Just after noon, a car came up the drive. Not unusual, there had been many visitors during Rommel's convalescence. But Lucy, looking out the window, felt ice in her stomach. She recognized the uniforms, General Wilhelm Burgdorf and General Ernst Meisel, both from Hitler's personal staff, men who did not make social calls. Rommel met them at the door. His uniform was crisp despite his injuries, his bearing still proud even though his body ached. Whatever was coming, he would face it as a soldier. Burgdorf and Meisel saluted, a formality that felt obscene given what they carried. They wanted to speak privately. Rommel agreed, though he must have known. He must have seen it in their faces, in the way they would not quite meet his eyes. They went into his study and the door closed, and behind it, 3 men enacted a scene that would haunt German history. Burgdorf did most of the talking. His voice was flat, bureaucratic, as if he were discussing supply requisitions rather than a man's life. The charges were laid out with brutal efficiency. Rommel was implicated in the July 20 plot. The evidence was irrefutable. The Führer was deeply disappointed. There would have to be a trial, of course, public, with all the details exposed. The field marshal's family would be arrested. His staff would be executed. His honors would be stripped away. The name Rommel would become synonymous with treachery. Unless. There was always an unless, wasn't there?
Hitler, in his infinite mercy, was offering an alternative, a more dignified solution. If Rommel took poison within the hour, it would all go away. His death would be announced as the result of his injuries from the car crash, a hero's death, mourned by the nation. His family would be protected. His staff would be safe. A state funeral with full military honors. His pension would continue to his widow. All he had to do was die quietly, conveniently, without fuss. It was not a choice. It was an execution dressed up as mercy. But Rommel understood the calculation. If he refused, if he demanded a trial, they would still kill him, but not before they destroyed everyone he loved. They would torture the truth out of him, or manufacture it if torture failed. They would parade him before cameras, broken and humiliated, and then they would hang him and arrest Lucy and probably kill young Manfred too, just to be thorough. Hitler was offering him one last gift, the chance to save his family, the chance to die as the hero Germany believed him to be, rather than the traitor the regime needed him to become. It was monstrous. It was genius. It was exactly the kind of evil that had consumed Germany. Rommel asked for time to think. Bergdorf looked at his watch. 15 minutes, the general said. The Führer was not a patient man.
Rommel walked out of his study, knowing he would never return. His face was pale but composed, the same face he had worn before 1,000 battles, calm in the eye of the storm. Lucy saw him and knew immediately. A wife knows. She had lived with this man through war and peace, through triumph and disaster. She knew his face better than her own. He asked her to come upstairs. Manfred followed, sensing that something terrible was unfolding. In the bedroom, away from the generals waiting below, Rommel told them everything. His voice was steady, factual, as if he were briefing officers on a military situation, but his hands shook slightly as he held Lucy's. They were going to kill him, he explained. The charges were false, but that did not matter. Hitler wanted him dead, and Hitler always got what he wanted eventually. But if he took his own life now, the regime would protect them. They would be safe. It was the only way. Lucy's face crumpled. This strong woman who had waded through years of war, who had prayed through countless battles, felt her world ending. She wanted to scream, to fight, to tell him to run, to hide, to do anything but surrender to this obscenity. But she had been a soldier's wife too long. She understood duty, sacrifice, the terrible calculations that war demanded. And she understood that her husband was making one final calculation, his life for theirs. Manfred, 15 years old, still in his Hitler Youth uniform, felt something shatter inside him. He had grown up worshiping his father, believing in the cause, trusting that Germany was right and just and good. Now he learned that the regime he served wanted to murder the man he loved most in the world. The boy who had saluted Hitler's portrait would carry this moment for the rest of his life, this knowledge of what Germany had become. Rommel held them both. He spoke softly, telling them he loved them, that they must be strong, that Germany would need honest people when this was all over. He told Manfred to take care of his mother. He told Lucy that she had made him happy, that every moment with her had been a gift. These were the words you say when there are no more words, when everything important has already been said, and all that remains is goodbye. How much time did they have? 10 minutes? 5? The clock was ticking, counting down to an ending that felt both inevitable and impossible. Rommel straightened his uniform one last time. He picked up his field marshal's baton, the symbol of his rank and achievement. He looked at his wife and son, trying to memorize their faces, to carry them with him into whatever darkness waited beyond. Lucy could not speak. She could only touch his face, as if touch could say what words could not. Manfred stood rigid, fighting tears, trying to be the soldier his father had taught him to be. Rommel kissed his wife, he embraced his son, then he walked to the door, and each step must have felt like walking through water, through concrete, through the weight of everything he was leaving behind. At the door, he turned. One last look. One final moment where they were all together, all alive, all in the same world. Then he nodded, a crisp military nod, and walked down the stairs to where the generals waited with their poison and their lies.
The generals were waiting in the hall, patient as executioners. They had done this before, not often, but enough to know the routine. Rommel appeared, and something in his bearing told them everything. He had made his choice. Or rather, he had accepted that there was no choice to make. He spoke briefly to his aide, Captain Hermann Aldinger, a man who had served with him since Africa. Aldinger's face showed his anguish, but he said nothing. What was there to say? Rommel gave him simple instructions about his affairs, about matters that needed attention. His voice was steady, professional, as if he were going to a meeting rather than his death. Bergdorf and Meisel led him outside. The autumn sun was bright, almost cheerful, a mockery of the moment. A car waited, a dark sedan that would become Rommel's hearse. The driver was SS, as were the men standing guard. Everyone knew what was happening. No one spoke. Rommel walked to the car with his head high. He moved with the same confidence he had shown crossing the North African desert, the same calm he had displayed under fire. If he was afraid, and he must have been, because he was human, because death is terrifying, no matter how brave you are, it did not show. This was his last performance, his final act as the Desert Fox, and he would play it perfectly. He paused before getting in. He looked back at his house, at the windows where he knew Lucy and Manfred were watching. He could not see them through the glass, but he knew they were there. He raised his hand, a small gesture, a final farewell. Then he climbed into the car and sat in the back seat between the two generals. The car pulled away. The driver followed a road that led into the nearby woods, away from the village, away from witnesses. Inside the car, no one spoke. What was there to say? Bergdorf and Meisel sat on either side of Rommel like guards, escorting the prisoner, which is exactly what they were. Rommel looked out the window, watching the familiar countryside roll past. Trees he had seen 1,000 times. Hills he knew by name. Germany, the land he loved. The land that was killing him. He thought about his life, the battles he had won, the men he had led, the strange, terrible beauty of war. He thought about Lucy's smile, Manfred's laughter, moments of peace stolen between campaigns. He thought about the oath he had sworn, to serve Germany, to protect it. He wondered if he had failed, or if Germany had failed him. Perhaps both were true. Perhaps neither mattered now. The car stopped in a quiet place, a clearing among the trees. Beautiful, really, if you ignored why you were there. Bergdorf produced a small wooden box, opened it. Inside were glass capsules, cyanide, quick and certain. He offered it to Rommel as if it were a gift. Rommel took it. His hand did not shake. He looked at the capsule, this tiny thing that would end everything. He must have thought about refusing, about fighting, about making them shoot him. But that would break their deal. That would doom Lucy and Manfred. So he held the capsule, held his death, held the final burden he would carry. He said goodbye. Simple words, professional. Then he bit down. Cyanide works fast. There was pain, brief, intense, the body's final protest. Rommel convulsed. The generals watched, unmoved, waiting. It took only seconds. The greatest general of the war, the man who had defied empires, died in the back seat of a car in a forest clearing, murdered by the regime he had served. Bergdorf checked his pulse, nodded. It was done.
The driver was ordered to take the body to the hospital in Ulm, where doctors would confirm what everyone already knew. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was dead.
At the hospital, doctors examined the body with careful professionalism. They knew what they were looking at. Cyanide has a distinctive smell, like bitter almonds, but the official report would say nothing about poison. Instead, it would note that Field Marshal Rommel had died of complications from his earlier injuries, specifically a cerebral embolism, a blood clot to the brain. Tragic, but natural, the kind of thing that happens after serious head trauma. The lie was told smoothly, efficiently. Everyone involved knew their roles. The doctors signed the death certificate without hesitation. The hospital administrators made no inquiries. The regime had turned lying into an art form, and this was just one more brushstroke on a canvas already dripping with deception. The announcement came quickly. Radio Berlin interrupted regular programming with solemn music, then a grave announcer's voice. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, hero of the Reich, the Desert Fox, had succumbed to his injuries sustained in service to the fatherland. The nation mourned. Flags were lowered to half-mast. Hitler sent a personal telegram to the widow expressing his deep sorrow at the loss of such a great soldier. The propaganda machine moved into full operation. Newspapers printed glowing obituaries. Rommel was praised as a military genius, a loyal soldier, a true German hero. His victories in Africa were recounted in loving detail. His service to the nation was elevated to myth. Not a word about treason, not a whisper about the July 20 plot. The man the regime had murdered became the man the regime mourned. Lucy received the telegram from Hitler. She read it, this message of condolence from her husband's murderer, and felt a fury so profound it left her shaking. But she could say nothing. She could reveal nothing. To expose the truth would destroy everything Rommel had died to protect. So she played her part in the charade, the grieving widow, accepting sympathy from the man who had ordered her husband's death. Manfred learned in that terrible moment what it meant to live under a totalitarian regime. You could know the truth, could hold it burning in your heart, but you could never speak it. To speak was to die. So you swallowed the truth, let it poison you from within, and nodded when people offered their condolences for your father's tragic accident. The funeral was scheduled for October 18th in Ulm. Hitler offered a state funeral in Berlin, but Lucy refused. One small act of defiance she could permit herself. So it would be in Ulm, with full military honors, with generals and dignitaries and crowds of mourners who believed the lie they had been told.
The day of the funeral was cold and gray, fitting weather for such a hollow ceremony. Thousands gathered in Ulm to pay their respects. They lined the streets, somber and sincere in their grief. They loved Rommel, these ordinary Germans. He represented something they wanted to believe in, that Germany was honorable, that their soldiers were heroes, that all the suffering had meaning. The coffin lay in state, draped with the Nazi flag that Rommel had served under, and that had ultimately killed him. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, once Rommel's superior, delivered the eulogy. His words were beautiful and hollow, praising Rommel's courage, his brilliance, his loyalty to the Führer. Rundstedt knew the truth, at least some of it, but he spoke the lies anyway, because that was what survival required. Hitler did not attend. He sent representatives, men who laid wreaths and saluted and spoke of honor while participating in murder. The entire ceremony was a grotesque performance, a public lie told with military precision. And the crowds believed it, because they needed to believe it, because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. Lucy stood through it all, veiled and silent. Manfred beside her, rigid with suppressed rage and grief. They watched their husband and father being mourned by people who had killed him, celebrated by a regime that feared him. And they said nothing, because they had promised, because that was the price of survival. The propaganda continued for weeks. Rommel's image appeared everywhere, on posters, in newsreels, in commemorative stamps. He became a symbol of German military excellence, used to shore up morale as the war spiraled toward its inevitable conclusion.
The regime that had murdered him exploited his death to inspire others to fight and die for a cause that was already lost. But truth has a way of surviving, even when buried under lies. Whispers began almost immediately. Officers who knew Rommel, who understood how these things worked, wondered quietly among themselves. Some had heard rumors about the July 20 plot, about investigations, about names. They could add two and two together. As the war ground toward its catastrophic end, as Germany collapsed and the regime crumbled, the truth began to surface. Officers who had been involved in the plot, who had survived the purges, started to talk. Documents emerged. Testimonies were given. The story of what really happened to Rommel pieced itself together from fragments and whispers. After the war, when the Allies occupied Germany and began examining Nazi crimes, the full horror became clear. Bergdorf and Maisel were both dead. Bergdorf had committed suicide as the war ended, taking his secrets with him. But others talked. Aldinger, Rommel's faithful aide, told what he knew. Lucy and Manfred, finally free to speak, shared their truth. The world learned that Germany's greatest general had not died from his injuries, but had been murdered by his own government. The state funeral had been a charade. The telegrams of sympathy had been written by his killers. Hitler had not mourned Rommel, he had orchestrated his death. The revelation shocked even those who thought they understood Nazi brutality. If the regime could murder its most famous general, its most celebrated hero, what wouldn't it do? Rommel's death became a symbol of the paranoia and evil that consumed Nazi Germany, the way the regime devoured even its own champions.
In the decades after the war, Rommel became something more complex than a simple hero or villain. Historians debated his legacy. Had he been truly honorable or merely less monstrous than others? Did his service to Hitler make him complicit in Nazi crimes, or did his resistance at the end redeem him? The truth, as always, was complicated. Rommel had served the Nazi regime faithfully for years. He had won victories that prolonged the war. He had worn the uniform, taken the promotions, accepted the honors. He could not claim innocence from the broader evil, even if his own hands remained relatively clean. But context matters. Rommel was a soldier in a militaristic society, trained from youth to obey orders and serve the state. He had believed, as many did, that he was defending Germany, not serving a genocidal dictatorship. By the time he understood what he was truly part of, he was trapped in a machine that destroyed anyone who tried to escape it. What made Rommel remarkable was not that he was perfect, but that he tried to remain decent in indecent times. He protected prisoners when others executed them. He disobeyed criminal orders when others followed them without question. He spoke truth to power when others only whispered lies. And when he finally understood the full extent of the evil he served, he turned against it, even knowing it would cost him everything. His death became a symbol of what happens when good men serve bad causes, when honor becomes twisted in service to dishonor. The desert fox, who had outwitted armies and conquered deserts, could not outwit or conquer the poisonous regime he served. In the end, it consumed him, as it consumed millions of others. But his choice in those final moments mattered. Given the ultimatum, die quietly or watch his family destroyed, Rommel chose sacrifice. He could have demanded the trial, could have tried to expose the regime's corruption, could have gone down fighting. But he chose differently. He chose to save what he could save: his wife, his son, their futures. It was not a heroic death in the traditional sense. There were no final stands, no glorious last words, just a bitter capsule in a quiet forest, a father protecting his family the only way he still could. History has been kinder to Rommel than to most of Hitler's generals. Even his enemies respected him. The British erected a memorial to him. The Americans studied his tactics.
In Germany, he became the acceptable face of the Wehrmacht, the general you could admire without feeling complicit in Nazi crimes. Perhaps that was fair. Perhaps it was too generous. Perhaps both. What endures is the image of a man caught between duty and conscience, a soldier who served evil but tried to remain good, who ultimately paid the highest price for his moment of moral clarity. Rommel was not a saint. He was not a resistance hero. He was a brilliant general who served a monstrous regime, who woke too late to the full horror of what he was part of, and who died trying to make one final choice that mattered. On a hillside in Herlingen, there is a simple grave. No grand monument, no towering memorial, just a stone with a name. Erwin Rommel. People still visit it, still leave flowers, still remember the man who became the Desert Fox. Some see a hero, some see a cautionary tale. All see a human being who tried to navigate impossible choices in the darkest period of human history. The October afternoon when Rommel died, the sun continued to shine. The trees continued their autumn dance. The world kept turning, indifferent to the ending of one man's story. But that story would echo through the decades, a reminder of how tyranny destroys even its champions, how honor becomes lethal in corrupt systems, how the choice between honor and survival sometimes offers no good options at all. Erwin Rommel lived 52 years. He won great victories and suffered great defeats. He served with distinction and died in disgrace. He was brilliant and blind, courageous and compromised, a hero and a warning. In the end, perhaps that complexity is his truest legacy, not as a simple symbol, but as a reminder that history is made by flawed human beings making difficult choices in impossible circumstances. The Desert Fox is gone, but the questions his life and death raise remain. How do we serve our countries when our countries become evil? How do we maintain honor in systems designed to destroy it? How do we protect what we love when love itself becomes a weapon against us? Rommel faced these questions, and they destroyed him. We remember him not because he answered them perfectly, but because he faced them at all, and because in facing them, he showed us the terrible cost of remaining human in inhuman times.